Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So in Fresh Red Kills, I talk about books that I've recently finished reading, and I'm going to be talking about two that I finished reading in February, two which deal with Roman history. I read these for Historathon 2024, which is a year-long reading event in which myself and some great co-hosts and a bunch of other great people, we are reading, discussing, celebrating nonfiction history throughout the year. We divide the year up into 4 quarters, each quarter looking at a different time period, and quarter one looks at prehistory up to the year 500 CE. So I decided in February to concentrate on ancient Rome. In January, I'd read a biography of Hannibal, and that was largely in preparation for reading Polybius, the history. So I'll start with that one. For the past few years, I and sort of a group as well, many of them attached to Historathon, have been reading ancient historians. A few years back, we started with Herodotus. Then following year, we read Thucydides, and then last year we read Xenophon. So both of his works, the Anabasis and Hellenica. And now it is Polybius's turn. So we are leaving, at least partly, leaving Greek history behind and getting into Roman history. And I had known about Polybius because I have read, a few books at least on Hannibal and the Second Punic War, he's one of the most interesting historical figures for me. And that Punic War, the second one again, is just absolutely fascinating, I think. And of course, his name constantly popped up because he and later historian Livy are our main sources for information about that war. So I was really looking forward to this. And unfortunately, this Polybius does not exist in a landmark edition. I love the landmark editions. That's what I read the previous ancient historians in. And this is not anything against, was it Robin Waterfield's translation here? I'll talk about that in a moment. Or even against Oxford University Press, who puts these out. I was really missing the maps and the footnotes and the image artifacts, all the stuff that they put in the landmark editions. That helps so much, especially when you talk about Greek history, which he does, at least in some of the books here. Because whenever you talk about ancient Greek history, you were talking about so many different city-states and you're bouncing around all the time. And without maps to reference, it can be very difficult to either keep track or to keep, for me, like kind of keep my attention because I'm being thrown a lot of information that isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily have concrete connections to my already whatever knowledge base I have. I don't know if I'm saying that in a way that makes sense, but essentially all that information kind of becomes very esoteric because I don't have enough context. But thankfully, a lot of Polybius is also dealing with Rome, which is generally staying in one geographic area, and I think it's a lot easier to follow. So I believe this copy, I think, if I remember correctly, a few years ago, when I first got into booktube, I think that Michael K. Vaughan sent me this as part of a little kind of care package. So I just want to thank him for this. I'm really glad that I had it. A few months ago, Steve Donahue had made a video about this. I think it was part of his Bookshelf Essentials, and he had sort of complained about the Robin Waterfield translation. Not that he thought it was a bad translation. It was more the philosophy that Robin Waterfield took. In the introduction, Robin Waterfield basically says that he was doing a lot of rewriting for Polybius. That Polybius wrote in sort of an archaic form of Greek. He was a Greek historian, although he was writing about Rome, and he was largely in Rome when he was writing. But Robin Waterfield, he might be changing Polybius enough where you're not entirely sure if you're reading Polybius or if you're reading Waterfield. And he does sort of modernize him in different ways. Like, he adds footnotes here. That is a footnote that he has created basically for Polybius, thinking that the way that Polybius is writing, he would today have been using footnotes for that kind of information. So he has done that. And I can kind of understand, to make it more accessible or readable for a modern audience, but I kind of also understand what Steve Donahue was saying in his video, that, sometimes when you pick up Polybius, you want to read Polybius, not necessarily Robin Waterfield. That being said, I think this was very readable, and I think that Waterfield still did a really good job here. As usual, I enjoyed the introductory essay that Oxford University Press usually puts out. I had also read, you can kind of see them behind me. I have a couple Michael Grant books that look at the ancient historians, so I read those sections as well about Polybius. And so, enough rambling, I guess we can actually talk about what's in the book. So, Polybius was writing in the 2nd century BCE. Again, he was Greek, he was part of the Achaean League. At one point, the Romans basically demand some elite or aristocratic hostages to stay in Rome. And ostensibly, I guess they were supposed to be put on trial. Polybius he's one of the people that is sent to Rome, although trial never happens. They're kind of kept there for a long time. Some of the hostages end up dying off, I think largely natural causes, but after enough time, they're basically kind of just let go. And Polybius, though, when he is in Rome, he really ingratiates himself to, especially one particular family in Rome, the Scipios, who are very famous for Scipio Africanus for defeating Hannibal Barca in the Second Punic War. And he becomes very, very good friends with Scipio Menelaus. I don't know if I'm saying that right or if I remember it correctly, who was one of Scipio's descendants. I don't remember if he was like a grandson or exactly what it was, or a son, but he is basically the conqueror of Carthage in the Third Punic War, and he becomes very good friends with him. And he decides that he is writing a history, a world history. This is unlike earlier histories. He is not writing about a particular war. He wants to write a connected world history, a universal history. So he is trying to let the reader know essentially what is going on at different parts of the world at a given time. So he does kind of jump around a lot, but I understand what he's doing here. And he seems to also be trying to explain the Roman world to Greek readers. That's his audience, it's the Greeks. And by this point, Rome has conquered a large portion of the Mediterranean. And Polybius doesn't see that as an entirely bad thing. He is largely pro-Roman, and he is sort of trying to explain to people why it's not a bad thing, why it's ultimately pretty good that maybe Rome has control over things. And, these are some really good qualities about them, and why maybe we should, allow them to control some things. That seems to be what he's getting at. At the same time, he is not blind to Rome. When he sees criticism, does Rome deserving of criticism, he does give it. So I give him that credit. Now, most of Polybius is missing. A lot of it has disappeared. We have largely fragments. The first 5 books we have intact, and that is in this collection. And this collection also has what has survived of book 6 and book 12. So I'm not going to go into depth here, but just kind of give my general overview or my thoughts here. So the first book deals largely with the First Punic War, and he ends up focusing quite a bit on Hamilcar Barca, who was Hannibal's father. And, like I said, for somebody who's pro-Roman, he actually seems to really like Hamilcar. And you wouldn't know it, I think, reading that first book, that he was super pro-Roman, the way that he writes about Hamilcar and the Carthaginians. I felt a little more sympathy for them and for Hamilcar than I did for the Romans. He does seem to kind of blame Rome for a lot of the things that go wrong during that time. So that was fascinating. I think that Hamilcar is a really interesting guy. The second book talks about some things that are going on in Spain. It goes into the background of the Romans and their fights with the Celts in the northern part of Italy. I thought that stuff was actually really interesting. And I think in that one, if I remember correctly, we do go a little bit into the Greeks again. And then the third book, which was my favorite, that's when he starts talking about the Second Punic War, and he focuses on Hannibal Barca. Basically, his time in Spain, his crossing of the Alps, and his defeat over and over again of the Romans, at least up until the defeat of the biggest army Rome had ever assembled at the Battle of Cannae. And he kind of leaves us hanging there because the stuff that he wrote afterwards seems to largely be gone. I think there may be fragments that are around, but they're not in this book, and I don't think that they're very substantial. The fourth book and the fifth book, if I remember correctly, they start talking about things like the social war in Greece. He starts going into some of the conflicts with like Egypt, those areas. So that's where, again, it starts being a lot of names and a lot of cities, and I would be lying if I wouldn't say that my attention starts to wander a little bit more in those situations when I don't have, like I said, maps and stuff like that to keep me there. So I read it all. I don't remember it all. Um, what is in survival, or what in survival? What has survived of books 6 and 12 are in here. Book 6 was really interesting. It's like a glimpse into social history. It looks at the Roman Constitution, and Polybius was of the opinion that the Roman Constitution was the best version that had been created. It's a little bit of monarchy, a little bit of oligarchy, a little bit of democracy, just enough, it seems like, of each thing. And he largely approved of that. And the other part of the book looks at the Roman military and the life of a Roman soldier, which I thought was really interesting. You realize just how sort of minutely thought out and in control the Romans were in their army, and it's just really interesting. I just thought that the social aspects and the glimpse into the world that we got of the Romans was really interesting. And book 12, he's essentially going against another ancient historian, one who was sort of like, I don't know about a gold standard, but incredibly popular before Polybius's time. And he's basically tearing him a new one. It is like just a takedown. It's like he's just roasting this historian over the fires. Now, I know that Polybius has a reputation for being pompous. I don't know if that's necessarily how he felt with that. Of course, I didn't know how deserving that historian was of the criticisms. Polybius is definitely confident, but he does actually have some pretty good reasoning. And he's got nice little turns of phrase, and overall, I enjoyed reading Polybius quite a bit, especially book 1 and 3. I just thought were stellar. I really enjoyed those a lot. But yeah, really glad that I read it. Next year, I'm thinking about reading maybe Caesar, maybe his Sullus. Hopefully, I'm remembering that right. Maybe him as well. But yeah, and then maybe the year after that, maybe Livy. If maybe not all of them, because a lot more of Livy survives than Polybius. But yeah, that's the first thing that I read in February regarding ancient Rome. And the second thing that I read was this. The Fires of Vesuvius, Pompeii, Lost and Found by Mary Beard. And this one was from, I think, Harvard University Press. Now, which one was this? So I just remember who the publisher is here. Yeah, Harvard University Press book. I believe in the UK, this was published as like Pompeii, like something about life in Pompeii. This one has a little bit more of a dramatic title. But I like it. I actually like the title. I like this cover design quite a bit. And the actual hardcover is a nice green as well. But yeah, really nice cover design on this. I was happy to find this. I wish I remember exactly where. I found it secondhand. I don't remember if it was at like a Goodwill or if it was maybe a library book sale. I know I got it super cheap, but it's in great condition. And after reading it, I am really happy that I picked this up. I thought this was excellent. I am somebody who is really, even though I was just talking about how much I like reading about Hannibal in the Second Punic War, I would not consider myself somebody who is deeply attracted to military history. I like reading about a good battle here and there, but I am far more interested in the lives of people, the daily lives. I like social history and cultural history, and this is just chock full of that. So Mary Beard, she is telling us the story of Pompeii, at least what the evidence shows. But it's not just the Pompeii of the year 79, when Vesuvius erupted. It is also the Pompeii of today as a tourist attraction. And Pompeii, of the last century or so, or 2 centuries, as it was being uncovered. So we have all these kind of historical layers to Pompeii. And we have some maps. We have tons of images. There are just so many images. I mean, you have these great full color images, but we also have black and white images. I mean, just about every page I turn to, there's something there. There is so much visual references in here that I just found absolutely wonderful. And a lot of what she is doing is also sort of correcting things. She discusses the sorts of things that tour guides will tell about Pompeii, often with what seems like such conviction and, confidence. And she is often dispelling that, saying, no, we really don't know. I'm at turns in awe of what we know about Pompeii with the evidence we have, and then at the same time, just in awe of how much we don't know. Like maybe we know what a certain room was used for, but we have no idea actually what went on in there. Even something like a triclinium, the three couches that people would kind of lounge on to eat, this very ubiquitous image of ancient Rome. How little we actually know about what went on inside these things is fascinating. So she's doing that. And she goes into the various buildings that people would walk in and see. So you couldn't ask, I think, for a better, guidebook. Especially for somebody like me, or people like me who just love to dig into the history and want to be able to walk into an old room, like an ancient room, and wonder what went on, what did it sound like, what did it smell like, what was it like for people living in there. But of course, you have all these layers, and this red really struck me as something as she's talking about here, how much we've lost over time. How things that were uncovered in Pompeii in like the late 1700s, early 1800s, these incredibly vivid colors that were on some of these walls, and how they're completely faded, and how many of the images that she's going off of and that she's explaining, she also has to explain to us, well, this is from a 19th century drawing of that image because it's gone now, it's faded, we can't even see it. So we're constantly learning, and we're constantly being reminded of the things that we'll probably never know. But the topics she covers were exhaustive, but not in a bad way. I don't mean I was exhausted, but things that I would just never really think of, and the way that she's able to go into detail. So I'll just read the chapters real quick. It's living in an old city, street life, house and home, painting and decorating. So she goes into like the things that are on the walls, right? How people would decorate. Earning a living, baker, banker, and garum maker. Who ran the city? Pleasures of the body, food, wine, sex, and baths. Fun and games, and a city full of gods. So we get into the religious aspect there. But yeah, there's not too much that I can really add to a discussion of this, but I would highly recommend this if you're somebody who likes social history and want a glimpse into the Roman world. Again, this isn't, Pompeii was its own city. It was certainly within the Roman sphere, but it had some differences in Rome. I just thought this was absolutely fascinating, and I really like Mary Beard's writing style. I think it's very conversational, but not in like a condescending way at all. She's very, very approachable. So yeah, and I should mention I had read her SPQR a few years ago, which I liked quite a bit. I see that being recommended to people as like an introduction to Rome. I would not recommend that book if you have never read anything about Rome. That's a good overview for people who have some background. She assumes that you know some things about Rome. And I would say she assumes that you're familiar with the site sort of here. Now, I've never been to Pompeii. I probably should have mentioned that. I've been to Rome, but I haven't been to Pompeii. But it makes me want to go. But she does a good enough picture of painting the place. But she is kind of assuming too that a lot of the people reading this would have taken the tour. And I've also read Mary Beard's Women in Power, her little kind of short manifesto, which was okay. I like the historical aspects. I thought the other aspects immediately didn't age as well. But not as far as message. I mean, like just the examples that she was giving. But this one I would wholeheartedly recommend. So I like this a lot. So yeah, I was really happy with these two February Historathon Quarter 1 reads, delving into the Roman Empire. Absolutely fascinating. So is Polybius the history, and we've got the fires of Vesuvius. If you've read either of these, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.